On today's episode of the Post-Christian Podcast, we have Dr. Terence Lester. How are you doing, Terence?
I am doing well. Thank you for having me again, Eric.
Absolutely. It's good to have you back. In 2020, we had a great conversation about some of your work helping those who are often unseen, those in poverty, those without a home. In fact, you talked about living on the streets for a month. Your wife and kids gave you the green light to do that. But since then, and just following your journey, you've gotten a PhD, you've written two more books, a new one's about to come out. But you and your wife also survived a just horrific car crash. In fact, if I remember right, it was a night of an award ceremony. Is that right?
Yeah. Yeah, it was May 14th, 2022, the night before my wife and I had gone to an award ceremony to receive an award on behalf of the work that we do at Love Beyond Walls. And we were really excited, right? We were just reflecting on the moment and what God was doing in our lives. And then the very next day, I turned to my wife. We were sitting on the couch, and I say, "Hey, we should go out and just celebrate because sometimes we just rush past things, right? And just like look for the next thing." And we just wanted to be in the moment. And so we invited a couple of friends to go out to dinner with us. And we were in a restaurant, and dinner ends, and we are about to leave. And I asked my wife really gently, I said, "See, do you mind driving?" Because I was kind of tired, and she agreed. And I fell asleep in the passenger seat. The next thing I know, I wake up and I'm literally on the ground. And I look over my shoulder and I literally hear EMTs running over to me. And I heard this person in the background scream out, "Flip him over to see if he's still alive." And I blacked out. And then I wake up again and I look up and I see the car that my wife and I were in. It's mangled and she's literally limping around the car to make it over to my body. I wake up again in the hospital with doctors standing over me, telling me that I had crushed both my hip and my pelvis, that they had to do an emergency surgery, two emergency surgeries, because my femur was near uh, a major nerve in my spine. The femur like burst through my hip and my pelvis. And so, yeah, 10 hours later, I wake up and again, this surgeon is standing over me saying everything went well, but um, it's going to be a while before you can walk.
Mm.
And, it kind of ends there. And then I'll pick back up, if you want to ask me more about how I was able to,
Yes. I mean,
overcome.
I
Yeah.
feel like I feel like I mean, you've always been an advocate for those who are hurting. And you went through such a remarkable recovery. I mean, I'd love for you to share more of that story, but also what you learned in the journey of making it back as you have.
Yeah. Man, I learned a lot of things. I remember just being in the hospital where I was. Um, it's a communal hospital, and it's also a hospital that services a lot of people who are impoverished and sometimes unhoused. But this hospital has one of the best trauma care units in the entire state. It's actually number one. And so even if I would have gone to a more privileged, quote unquote, hospital, they probably would have airlifted me back to this hospital because that's where all of the trauma victims or persons who have experienced trauma go. And so I go through the surgery and then I go into like the communal care part and I'm there for a while. And man, um, I still remember the mistreatment, the missed meals, um, the medical staff not necessarily responding to my pain or giving me medication. And I still remember the screams that I would hear at night from other people in rooms adjacent to me or like down the hall of neglect and negligence. And I remember sitting there, or laying there rather, and I'm like, here it is. I'm an advocate on behalf of those who are impoverished in our country, and I can't do anything about it, um, because I too am in need of care. And I just realized that sometimes we create cultures around how we show up and either have compassion towards, or the lack of compassion towards those who are poor. And it didn't matter if I had good insurance, or I was a community leader, or any of those things. I was just a part of the environment that already had a culture of sometimes being apathetic or indifferent in how it shows up to care for those who are going through probably hardships and physical ailments and um, medical treatment. And so I learned that. And then the second thing is I learned that my worth wasn't necessarily tied to my mobility. And that's important for me, because I've been on several different podcasts. People have known that I've walked across the country, and I've used my physical body to do a lot of things to serve God in this way. And so, man, it was a real wake up call when I was just laying there and I couldn't find my sense of self worth in being productive. And, society, culture, sometimes even church, we kind of communicate this narrative in order to be, productive, or in order to be great, you have to serve. And sometimes that serve is attached to being mobile, and having, our worth defined by mobility is the wrong thing. And God really worked in my heart, man, and just made me realize that, you know, while I was laying there and breathing, I had worth and dignity and all of those things. It did not diminish God's love for me in that moment. And so that was one of the things that literally kept me going and grounded outside of my wife showing up and becoming my primary caregiver.
How long were you in the hospital? How long did it take until you were mobile again?
Yeah, it was about 26 days in the hospital, almost a month. Um, I remember being, in the hospital and then being transferred to do like inpatient physical therapy, and just the reality of how hard it would be for me to like move around and walk again. I had to relearn how to walk. Um, and that was a journey, it was a process. I mean, it took almost 6 months for me to get to a place where I didn't need any ADA accommodations. And I fought to do that, because they were telling me it was going to take a year to a year and a half before I could get back to move around on my own and drive and, go to the gym and all of those things. I'll tell
Mhm.
you the grace part of it though, man. Doing this work, met so many different people. I met this doctor by the name of Dr. Jerome Libby. He became a friend of mine. He has a private practice, and he's a chiropractor. Um, and when he learned about it, he reached out to my wife, and he says, I just want to offer up my Sundays to come spend time with Terrence. And so, you know, this brother would come over to my house with his family's permission and spend 4 hours with me working to help me, you know, regain strength, understand the connection between the brain and my nervous system, and helping me to do these types of exercises, the physical therapy part and the occupational therapy part, to help me get to a place where I could like use forearm crutches, and I was building strength, and I was gaining confidence in ways that, in the traditional environments wasn't affording me to. And so, sometimes I give a lot of credit to God, and I give credit for God using brothers like Dr. Jerome Libby, who showed up and served, didn't ask for anything, just came to my house. Imagine getting me out of bed on Sundays, man, spending 4 or 5 hours just answering questions, helping me to deal with my nerve pain, all of those things, and just becoming Jesus to me in that way. And, I was able to get back up.
It's a remarkable story. I mean, following you on Twitter, yeah, certainly praying for you these last, this last year. And somehow in the middle of all that, Terence, you continue to do the work, got your PhD, got a new book coming out. I want to talk about the book, but
Yeah.
I want to also hear not only how did you get through your PhD through this, but what did you learn in the process of your PhD? I mean, as a person who follows Jesus, as an advocate for those who need advocating, talk about what you studied.
Yeah. It's a really great question. I want to start off by just giving my wife so many flowers. I don't think I would be who I am had it not been for her. Like who I am in this moment, had it not been for her sacrifice and support. And we talk about like marriage and commitment and like to death do us part, and for rich or for poor, in sickness or in health, right? Like she embodied all of that in those moments when, I was getting 2 hours of sleep a day, taking 20 plus meals, not meals, but pills, taking 20 plus pills around the clock just to like reduce the pain that I was in. It never took it away. She became my primary caregiver. And I'll never forget, I had my moments, man, when I just felt like quitting. And I was laying in bed and I was thinking about my last semester of my PhD coming up. And I tell her, I said, I don't think I can do it because I'm still connecting my sense of self-worth, my ability to move. I'm like, I can't move around. I can't go to the restroom on my own, walk to the mailbox, like do some of the normal activities. And she looks at me and she says, you may not be able to move, but God still gave you your mind. Just use your mind.
Good.
And it just, man, I I found courage in that because, man, sometimes when you're in the crucible of life, or like when your back is against the wall and you don't feel like nothing can give you the strength to move forward. Like it reminded me of that scripture where Solomon is talking about in Ecclesiastes, two are better than one, right? Or if one falls down, there's the other one there to pick them up. And a threefold cord is not easily broken. And my wife just gave me that huge reminder that the third strand in the threefold cord was Jesus, and it's God's strength working perfectly in most vulnerable moments, in my weakness, in our weakness as a family. And that gave me the courage to finish. And so, a part of my PhD research, it's part traditional where I, research poverty, the social constructions of poverty, these types of ideas and narratives we have around this subject, the origins of that, especially within the context of Christianity and the US, the history of homelessness, the 5 periods of homelessness, as well as the 2 mass homelessness eras, trying to understand how do we go from homelessness being something that was connected to the term poverty, and it was something that during the second period, we would provide poorhouses and almshouses and open up, hospitals and police stations and fire stations to take in those who were unhoused. And that kind of morphed into, within the last context, within the last 5 decades, during the second mass era of homelessness, being something that becomes criminalized. And it's connected to public sanitation and the ridding of those who were unhoused and poor from cities, where we're kind of excluding them so we could not see the poor, right? Not see those who are experiencing homelessness. And that connected to the public policy that was really recently passed last year in the state of Tennessee that makes sleeping outside a Class E felony. And so my research actually looked at that public policy. I did a policy analysis and then just kind of like came up with research questions because I was concerned with at how public policy in real time would impact the sense of self-worth of those who are living on the street and how that actually keeps the unhoused from ML King's beloved community, where King is arguing that we're all interconnected, that we're interrelated, that we have to be interdependent of one another, and that the world is our address, right? And so, man, I went over to Tennessee. I lived on the streets in the month of January, and I shot a documentary called Homesick as a part of my dissertation. And so it was part written and part documentary where I got a chance to do street interviews and give people in real time the microphone to talk about how that policy was impacting them. And, you know, the findings were astounding. So that, I guess that work within itself just kept me going. Yeah.
Well, I love how your faith has really driven you. And as church leaders are listening, pastors are listening, you know, this
Yeah.
issue of folks who are homeless for the younger generations, it's important. And
Yeah.
as how we treat the least of these is a reflection on what we truly believe. And talk
Amen.
talk about When We Stand. This is your newest book, The Power of Seeking Justice Together. I would love to hear some of the insights. We're going to give away a few copies to those who sign up for my email newsletter, but talk about some of the insights you share in that book.
Yeah, you know, I just when We Stand came out, it came out in 2021 with InterVarsity Press. I think um, it was it was a very critical book, and I'll tell you why. It was critical because we were in a global pandemic. People were still divided on whether, like, should we go outside? Should we wear masks? Should we go to church? Should we be in public? Should we stay socially distant from one another? And like there was just so much division. And when I was writing the book, I had no idea that the things that the Lord was placing on my heart in terms of, you know, being connected, getting out of our bubble, you know, making sure we create more margin in our lives to show up in a way where we can serve needs in our communities and serve needs in our neighbors. You know, this whole concept of moving from me, like being me centric, to we centric, right? Which is a part of what Jesus is calling us to in the Gospels. And you know, like knowing this critical component of how we actually move forward together and we see the change that we want to see or longing for in community. I mean, when we think about injustice or some type of, you know, massive crisis that's happening in our communities or to those who are proximate to us, um, we can't tackle those things alone. We have to stand in community with other people. And I think that is what brings God glory, but it's also how we see real change happen. Even if it doesn't change things overnight on like a national scale, we can see those small, tangible changes to happen in the people that we're most proximate to. So in this book, I'm really calling people to proximity, right? Jesus was the best model of that, right? Philippians 2, John 1, you know, we talk about a Lord who literally took on flesh to come and dwell among people. And so, like, I'm really kind of trying to hammer that in when I talk about the importance of being in community, dwelling among people, being proximate to those who are in need, and not seeing this as something that you have to do in a solo oriented posture. it's something we get to go do together as we show up to serve Jesus.
I love it. And it's still a very important message we need. And your new book, All God's Children, How Confronting Buried History Can Build Racial Solidarity. I can't wait to get it. I
Yeah.
can't help but think of Daniel 9, the way Daniel prays on behalf of the sins of his people. He didn't
Yeah.
argue, well, I wasn't there, I didn't do it. He acknowledged the missteps, the evil that his ancestors had done. I wonder if that's
Mm.
an angle you head towards. I mean, talk about this new book. What can we learn from All God's Children?
Yeah. Man, I didn't learn Black history in school, and I'm 40 years old now. I still get emotional thinking about that the curriculum and the way that the lessons were designed in school did not give me an opportunity to come close to the history and heritage of, how I ended up here. Why did I grow up in the neighborhood or on the side of the town that I grew up on? Um, and I still get chills thinking about that. You know how I learned history, my brother?
How's that?
Sitting at the feet of my grandparents. Um, just 3 days ago, maybe 4 days ago, my grandmother, who is 91 years old, 91, she got a chance to come to Love Beyond Walls and visit the Dignity Museum, which is the first museum in the U.S. that represents homelessness. And so I got a chance to give her a personalized tour. And she's the oldest, but also the first family member that actually has gone through this museum. And
Wow.
I'll never forget walking her around, showing her the walls, playing the stories, and talking about the work that we do. And she turns towards me. I'm going to post this video soon because I recorded it. And she starts to talk to me about her childhood. She was born in 1932. And she says, I remember hostile architecture. The hostile architecture for me was I couldn't drink out of that water fountain. The hostile architecture for me is when schools were segregated. And when I would go to school, the books that I received were shabby and run down. She says the hostile architecture for me is when I wanted to go in a restaurant, they made Black people walk all the way around the building and enter in from the back. And sometimes you couldn't enter in at all. They would give you your meal at the back door. She says, when I wanted to go to a movie theater, I couldn't sit in the front. I couldn't sit on the front of the bus. And she was just naming all of these things. And here it is. She's still alive. Her mind is sharp and she can recount all of these things in vivid clarity, right? And I'm just taking all of this in. And I'm like, I know, there's several aspects of um, the erased history or the buried history that we don't get a chance to talk about because some people don't want to talk about those things that are being repeated just in different forms in this day and time. And what I'm really trying to get at in this book is tell people like I'm learning my history just like a white person may be learning Black history, right? And I'm, discovering things about myself and my heritage and my grandparents and how, my grandparents wasn't given the opportunity to read, right? And I get a chance to walk my grandmother in a bookstore not too long ago when ICU came out with University Press, and she picks up her grandson's book off the bookshelf in a Barnes and Noble, and she tells me these stories about like how her parents weren't able to read, bro. And like I think if we are really to honor God, we've got to honor everybody's history. If we're going to honor God, we got to see the humanity in all people, especially Black and brown people. And we've got to confront it in a way. where we deal with woeful ignorance and willful ignorance. Woeful ignorance is the type of ignorance where it's like, oh, that happened. I didn't know that. Well, now you're aware and you gain the type of education where you don't repeat the same mistakes. But willful ignorance is the stubborn ignorance. It's to say, I know that happened. I see it happening, but I'm still going to be stubborn. I'm going to turn away. And what I'm calling people to in this book is like, yo, like if we say we follow Jesus, if we say we love God, then we got to love all God's children. And we got to stand in solidarity with one another in a way that is glorifying to God. And it's respectful of the history and heritage of Black people. And we're doing that in a way that is not trying to shame anybody, but to give an invitation to say, hey, if you love me and you love all of me, and I'm your neighbor, come and stand alongside me.
Mm. So good. Thank you so much, Terence, for taking the time. TerenceLester.org. Pick up the new book, see the Dignity Museum there in College Park, Georgia. Keep up the great work. We're so grateful for Love Beyond Walls and so grateful you and your wife are doing so much better.
Oh, thank you. It's been a pleasure to talk to you, and I'm so grateful for the opportunity to be able to serve again.